Alrighty, folks. In this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about glandular epithelial tissue, and just there's not a ton to talk about here, but just there's some important concepts you need to know, especially when it comes to knowing the difference between endocrine and exocrine glands, and essentially what makes these two types of glands different, and also where you find these various glands throughout the body. And I'm going to put most of the focus on the exocrine glands in this presentation. All right. Now, when it comes, before we kind of jump into this topic here, we have to be acquainted with some new terminology that's going to get thrown at you. And basically, we haven't obviously have not gotten to the endocrine system yet, but after you're done with this chapter, you should know the difference between an endocrine and an exocrine gland. Okay, and I'm going to do a comparative. I'm going to kind of compare the two in the here pretty soon. Okay. Unicellular versus multicellular. Okay, so I mean, pretty straightforward. Uni equals 1. Okay, multi, many. Okay, so there are some glands of the body that are only single-celled, and most glands of the body are going to fall within this category, are going to be multicellular glands. And then essentially when it comes to understanding the differences between the glands, it's how are these multicellular glands organized? Basically what are the various shapes of these glands, and also what are some of the secretions that they produce. All right, so pretty simple, straightforward. Unicellular, single cell; multicellular, multiple cells. Axonous, basically, this is the part of the gland that's the secretory part of the gland. So, for example, if we look at an exocrine glands are basically just involutions, inward folds of epithelial tissue, and basically part of that inward fold of epithelial tissue is going to be a duct, and then another part of it's going to be a portion of the gland that contains the cells that produce the secretions of the gland. That's what the axonous is. Okay, essentially just the part of the gland that is producing the secretions and also releasing those secretions into the ducts and out of the gland. Okay, so the secretory region of the gland. Okay, alveolar, this is a term you're gonna run into as we are discussing these differences between exocrine glands. And essentially alveolar or alveolus means basically somewhere along the lines of small cavity or hollow cavity, depending on what book you take a look at. Okay, but essentially an alveolus is a small hollow cavity. Okay, and that's a word you're going to see a lot when we get to the respiratory system, because the small functional units of the lungs, the alveoli, those are important little air sacs where the gas exchange process occurs. So that's a word that you're going to be seeing again in Anatomy and Physiology Part 2 when you're learning about the physiologic anatomy of the lungs. Okay, and then these last three words, mecocrine, apocrine, and holocrine. I spelled that wrong. I always do that. It's merocrine. Sorry, I should have caught that. Merocrine. Okay, not mecocrine. I've been doing that ever since I was a student when it comes to this type of gland. I always spell it mecocrine for some reason. Okay, and basically what these terms are, these are terms to describe how glands release their secretions. Okay, and I'll talk about these more specifically, and I'll make sure to spell this properly the next time around. Sorry about that, folks. But I'll talk about how these various glands release their secretions once we kind of go over and have a better understanding of the glands themselves. Okay, so just be aware that this is going to be some new terminology that's going to be thrown at you. All right, so now let's take a look at some just some characteristics about glands that you have to understand. Okay, what a gland is, a gland is a structure that is composed of one or more cells. Remember, either unicellular or multicellular. Okay, that basically make and produce you know, fluids or chemical messages, okay? And this is where we have to start running into some differences between exocrine and endocrine glands. The chemical message aspect of this, i.e. hormones, all right, that is essentially an endocrine function. All right. Whereas these aqueous fluids or these fluid-like secretions are going to be more of an exocrine function. Okay, so that's one difference that we have to discuss. All right, and we'll get into the others here in a second. All right, so that's what glands are. They're basically active sites that are composed of one or more cells that produce and release secretions. And those secretions are either going to be chemical messages or some kind of a fluid, you know, that serve a purpose. You know, chemical messages are essentially used to regulate our homeostasis, and these aqueous fluids are used, you know, to eliminate waste or to cool our bodies or for communication purposes. Okay, there are various reasons why we produce these fluids. All right, and what you have to understand when it comes to understanding the differences between glands, basically between endocrine versus exocrine, we have to focus on the site of, you know, where hormones are produced, you know, the structure of the gland itself, how far the secretions travel, and so on. All right, and also, you know, the amount of cells that are found within here. So let's kind of chart this out a little bit and do a little bit of comparing and contrasting between endocrine and exocrine glands. All right, so we'll on this side go endocrine, and over here we'll go with exocrine. All right, so a structural difference between endocrine and exocrine glands that you need to pay attention to is the presence of ducts. Okay, exocrine glands have ducts. Okay, ducts. Sorry, I know it sounds like I'm saying ducks, like the bird, but they have ducts. Okay. All right. Whereas endocrine glands are ductless. Okay. Now, I mentioned this earlier, and I'm going to bring this up again, that basically glands are derived from epithelial tissue, all right? You know, and they start to develop, you know, during embryonic development, you know, at certain stages, and, you know, we don't need to get into all of the detail about that, but their endocrine glands wind up giving up their ducts. So essentially, an endocrine gland is going to be a cluster of cells, so endocrine glands are going to be multicellular glands, all right, that produce and secrete, and they'll produce, store, and secrete their hormones, all right, you know, like the thyroid gland or the pituitary, the anterior pituitary gland, or the testes or the ovaries, and so on. All right, so these are ductless glands, okay, that are composed of cells that produce and store and secrete their materials, their chemical messages. Okay, whereas exocrine glands are derived, you know, like as I mentioned before, these are involutions of epithelial tissues, okay, and then are broken down into two parts, the ducts and then the axonus. All right, and then so bear in mind that exocrine glands are connected to the surfaces where their secretions travel, which kind of leads me into the next distinguishable characteristics, is the distance that secretions travel. Okay, when it comes to endocrine glands, hormones travel over long distances. Okay, and they do so via blood. They do so via the bloodstream. All right, so basically endocrine glands secrete their hormones. The hormones diffuse into the tissue fluids, the tissue spaces of, well, the tissues that they're nearby, and then essentially these hormones diffuse into the bloodstream and then travel to whatever the target tissue is for that hormone. All right. Whereas with an exocrine gland, okay, we've got these axonar cells, okay, these active cells, all right, down here, you know, down inside the kind of the bulb or the pit of that gland, and then the glands, and then basically the secretions are released, and they travel up through the duct onto another body surface. Okay, so their secretions are traveling over a short distance. Okay, and a short distance onto other body surfaces. Now, I don't want you to always think that that exocrine secretions are always traveling outside of the body. Almost all the examples I'm going to talk about are going to be, exocrine glands found within the skin. But, for example, the liver and the pancreas are also have exocrine gland functions to them. All right. So, for example, and also both of these are derived, the ducts from these glands and some parts of the glands themselves are derived from epithelial tissue. So, for example, if you want to talk about the development of the pancreas, all right, the pancreas is found right, kind of snug right up next to the first 8 inches of the small intestine called the duodenum. Not duodenum, very commonly mispronounced medical term. Okay. And then essentially the pancreas kind of starts to form in 2 parts. Is for you see these little kind of bulbous bulges that form around the duodenum, but eventually they'll kind of hook around and connect to one another, and then you form the pancreas itself. And then the duct of the pancreas, basically, is opening right into the mucosal layer or the inner tissue layer of the duodenum, the first 8 inches of the small intestine. Same thing with the liver itself. Okay, part of the bile ducts, originate from the liver, and part of them bulge out from the epithelial lining of the duodenum as well. And then the 2 meet up, and then essentially they will, this particular duct will pass right through the head of the pancreas and open into the duodenum of the small intestine as well. All right. So, then this is called the common bile duct. And this opening here is called the sphincter of Oddi, or ODI. All right. So again, exocrine-like functions. Now, the reason why I say you should not always think of exocrine glands as just being secreted to the outside of the body, but to other body surfaces. These are secretions that are not meant to go towards the outside of the body. These are going from one organ or one structure to another body surface, to the inner lining of the small intestine. All right. And then essentially the secretion that travels, from the gallbladder and the liver towards the duodenum is bile, okay? And we need bile in order to digest fats. Bile takes part in a process called emulsification. All right, and basically, I'll talk about that when we get to the digestive system, but that's going to be an important thing to focus on. And then the main job, probably about 98% of the overall function of the pancreas, is exocrine. All right, because basically the cells within the pancreas are organized in these various islets that drain into this kind of central main pancreatic duct, and most of the cells in the islets are designed for producing digestive enzymes and other secretions that travel into the small intestine that aid in the digestive process. Okay, and then the other 2% of the pancreas is endocrine, and that's where you guys think of insulin and glucagon. All right, so the pancreas essentially is kind of one of those unique glands that has both endocrine and exocrine functions, and we would call this a mixed gland. Okay, a mixed gland. A mixed gland has both endocrine or exocrine and endocrine functions. Okay, but most glands in the body have, are just one or the other, endocrine or exocrine. All right, so that's something to keep in mind when it comes to the comparative differences between an endocrine and an exocrine gland. Endocrine glands are ductless. Exocrine glands move their secretions through ducts over short distances onto other body surfaces, whereas endocrine glands secrete their hormones into the tissue fluids of the, surrounding the gland. Those hormones diffuse into the bloodstream and then travel over a very long distance to their target tissue. Okay, so as a student, it's very important to know the difference between these 2 classes of glands. All right, and this is about where I'm going to stop with the endocrine function, just because we have there are chapters devoted to the endocrine system. So now let's kind of shift our focus over towards the various types of exocrine glands that you can find within the body. All right, and as I mentioned before, exocrine glands can be either multicellular or unicellular. The only real application when it comes to unicellular glands okay, are the mucus-producing glands of the body. All right, the mucus-producing glands of the body that we like to call goblet cells. All right, so basically these mucus secreting glands are located within the epithelial tissue that lines the GI tract and the respiratory tract, and essentially these. So, for example, if we want to. So remember your basic histology, being that this is a chapter on histology, the tissue that lines the respiratory tract or your conducting airways is the pseudostratified columnar epithelia. So we've got these really tall cells, we've got these short cells, these tall cells, all right, and it looks pseudostratified because some cells are shorter than others, all right, and then kind of tucked in between some of these cells are these kind of bulbous looking shapes called goblet cells. Okay, and basically these are single-celled glands, and their main job is to produce a protein called mucin. All right, so essentially, if you kind of want to take a look at the structure of a goblet cell, all right, a goblet cell, like any other cell, oops, up my markers, is going to have a nucleus. Okay, it's going to have a nucleus. It's going to have a lot of rough endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, and remember, wherever there's rough ER, rough endoplasmic reticulum, okay, probably throw some ribosomes on there, huh? All right, wherever there's rough ER, remember, those are proteins that are to be exported. Okay, because remember, ribosomes are the site where protein synthesis takes place. Okay, the nucleus contains DNA. DNA is the code to make proteins, and the rough endoplasmic reticulum is an outgrowth of the nuclear envelope filled with ribosomes. All right, and then basically remember that when we manufacture a protein on the rough ER, that it'll be packaged, from kind of folds, within folds of the rough ER, and then those little packages are going to travel to the structure that we like to call the Golgi. The Golgi. Some people like to call it the Golgi. Complex. Some books call it the Golgi apparatus. Some just say Golgi. All right. But you know that the Golgi is responsible for modifying proteins. Okay, modifying proteins, all right? And a big part of modifying proteins is rearranging their structure or conjugating proteins, attaching lipids or carbohydrates to these particular proteins, all right? And what the Golgi does with this protein mucin is it links it with a carbohydrate. So basically, mucin is a glycoprotein. All right, it's a glycoprotein. Okay, and then basically, you know how the Golgi works, is then the Golgi will, as these proteins are manufactured, there will be these kind of outpouchings of the Golgi, and you'll form these secretory vesicles. All right, and then these vesicles are going to accumulate, kind of in the duct of the goblet cell, and then eventually these secretory vesicles will fuse with the plasma membrane, and then their secretions will be emptied out. All right, and then this glycoprotein is going to mix with water, and then you put the two together, and that equals mucus. Okay, and that's how we get mucus lining the conducting airways of our respiratory system and of our GI tract as well. Now, typically the cells that are located in the GI tract are often called just mucus cells. All right, because the reason why these are called goblet cells, when all these secretory vesicles accumulate kind of in the upper surface of the cell, when you shine light on it, it looks like a goblet itself. A goblet with a bunch of, like bubbles or trapped up in the upper surface. All right. Whereas, you don't really see this in the cells that line the GI tract, so they're often just called mucus cells. Now, let's focus on this for a second. Mucus versus mucus. All right. When you see this spelled M-U-C-U-S, we're actually talking about mucus itself, or, I don't know, snot. Okay, you like to think of as snot, or, if you cough up a lung nugget, or if you pick your nose and, find a winner, up there, whatever it may be. Okay, mucus itself is the secretion. All right, when you see O-U-S, that means we're talking about the, mucous membranes. All right, so that's why when we call these, when we label these cells, we spell it this way, MUCOUS, because these are the cells that are found within the mucous membrane, and then they secrete mucus that basically forms kind of a lining along the membrane. Okay, so MUCUS is the actual mucus itself, or the secretion, and OUS is the lining, the mucous membrane. Okay, and this is really the only major practical example of unicellular glands within the human body. These these mucus-producing cells, these goblet cells, are just the mucus cells that you find in the GI tract. What's the histology of the GI tract again? You know, what's the? I should say of the small intestine. What would be the histology of the small intestine? Think about it. Think about it. If you said simple columnar, you are correct. All right. So now let's shift our focus onto the more complex exocrine glands of the body. Now, essentially what we can do when we're breaking down these glands, we can break them down you know, based on the complexity of their structure. Okay, the complexity of their structures. All right, so let's break these glands down into simple versus complex. So we'll just kind of do this again: simple, complex. We should make that look like an X, huh? There we are. All right, simple versus complex. So let's talk about the simple glands first. Now these are, you know, these are the glands that we're talking about that are found primarily within, you know, the skin of the body. Okay, most of them, I mean, most exocrine glands, I mean, they're very diverse, but they're also primarily found in the skin, with exceptions, you know, of, you know, in terms of complex glands, you know, like the they're multicellular glands. I mean, you know, like the liver and the pancreas. Those are obviously not found within the skin, but they're derivatives of epithelial linings. Okay, so basically, we call simple glands because they have unbranched ducts. They have unbranched ducts, whereas complex glands have branched ducts. Okay. And essentially the simple glands of the body, all right, you know, for example, are going to range. So I'll use black to represent the actual duct, and then I'll use red, okay, to represent the axonus. Okay. So remember the active part of the gland. All right, so some of the glands of the body, we've got some simple tubular glands that just are, you know, just like this. You know, one nice easy little duct, and then nice little active area there. Okay, and that's just what we call a, you know, essentially that's just what we call a simple tubular gland. All right, and you primarily find these located in various areas of the GI tract. Okay, you know, producing various secretions. All right, so again, you don't see, you know, very simply organized gland, just a very, you know, just one little active area, one duct. Okay, or, you know, another one you can see simple branched, or simple branched tubular. So they'll be like this. And then the active portions are going to be like so. All right, so essentially what you're looking at here are, again, you see one duct, and then you just see these various tubular, you know, these tubular extended active areas, okay? And a good way to think of these, you know, a good area to, you know, where you find these glands are essentially the gastric pits. The gastric pits of the body, you know, like the you know, in the stomach. Okay, so essentially, when you take a look at the, you know, if you're going into, you know, pathology or gastroenterology, and you really want to understand digestive physiology, this is, you know, when you're looking at the tissue in the stomach, this is essentially how it's organized. Okay, and then there are various cells that line these axonar, these active areas of the stomach, all right, that produce, various secretions that travel out of the, out onto the inner surface of the stomach. Okay, like digestive enzymes or hydrochloric acid and so on. Okay, so basically that, so again, we've got simple tubular. Oops. Simple tubular, simple branched tubular, sorry. All right. So these are the tubular ducts of the body, and then there are some ducts that we like to call alveolar ducts. Okay, so again, these, they're nice, simple, have one little duct, but then instead of seeing a tube, you see this kind of bulbous-like cavity. Okay, and that's what the alveolus is. An alveolus is an individual little bulbous end of that gland. All right, and then again, when it comes to these glands, this would be an example of a simple alveolar gland, which we don't really need to worry about in humans. But what we can find in humans would be a kind of a simple but branched alveolar gland. So there'll be something like this. Almost look like a three-leaf clover. Okay, and these are what would essentially be your sebaceous glands. All right, sebaceous glands are these oil-secreting glands that that you always find right next to hairs in the skin. Okay, so essentially, when we are developing, so let's say here's your skin. All right, and then you're developing a hair. So you've got your bulb down here, then you've got the root, then you've got the shaft. Okay. Essentially, what you're going to see, right next to here, you'll find these kind of bulbous-looking sebaceous glands. All right, and then these sebaceous glands, they produce these oils that travel up, that are secreted onto the hair, that travel up onto the hair, that essentially lubricate the hair and keep it moist. All right, and then these secretions may sink sometimes because bacteria on your skin would love to consume these oils, or or sometimes bacteria may get into these ducts and get into this gland, and then sit there and just chew on these oils all the time, but then you can develop what's called a sebaceous cyst. All right, so those are your sebaceous glands, and those are found in, sebaceous glands are highly concentrated on the scalp and in your axillary region and pubic region. So basically, areas where there's very thick tufts of hair. All right, and they're found in various other areas of the body as well, but those are the most highly concentrated. Okay, so those are some examples of your simple glands, and then your more complex glands, or your branched glands of the body, are going to be, basically we're going to classify these as compound alveolar or compound tubular, essentially. All right. So essentially with the, oops, just get my color straight here. So basically what you're going to see here is you'll see involution of the skin. Okay, and then what you'll notice is, so let's say we're looking at compound alveolar. So now what you're going to see, oops. Okay, so what you see are multiple acini, or these active regions, and also multiple ducts that are, that open up into, one main duct. Okay, so a good example of these would be, these compound alveolar glands would be mammary glands. Okay, mammary glands. All right, and essentially these mammary glands, you all know where these are found within the breast tissue, right behind, they're found, highly concentrated behind the active areas of the glands are kind of up within the breast tissue, and then these ducts all aggregate behind the areola of the breast, the colored portion of the nipple, and then open into the main, the main area, basically the nipple itself. All right, and then these secretions travel, again out these ducts. And little clinical application to this is the ducts of these glands are essentially the cause of breast cancer. All right, so that's why when it comes to biopsying or taking a look at whether it's a mammogram or you need to biopsy a lump you may find within breast tissue, you have to take a look at and analyze the epithelial tissue that makes up these glands, because that's where the tumors originate. Okay, so complex alveolar glands would be, so for example, again, mammary glands or salivary glands are another good example of these. Okay, salivary glands, again, these watery secretions that travel through these tubes or ducts on out, okay, to enter, other body surfaces, like obviously the mouth or, the outside of the skin for mammary glands. All right, and then these complex tubular, these two complex tubular ducts are going to be organized very similarly, except instead of seeing a bunch of alveoli, you're just going to see a bunch of, tubes, with multiple ducts. Whoops. With multiple. There we are. With multiple ducts that open up into this kind of main central duct. Okay, and again, these are some of the more complex glands that are found lining the, lining the GI tract, especially highly concentrated within the duodenum of the small intestine. Okay, so these are how we structurally organize, or structurally categorize, I should say, the exocrine glands of the body. And last but not least, let's kind of focus on those last three terms that were on the terms you need to know. Basically, merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine. Okay, so merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine. Okay, merocrine, not mecocrine. Okay, apocrine glands, are these really found in the human body? Good question. Okay, good question. It depends on which histologist you ask. Some people will say mammary glands kind of fall into this category. Some will say no. Okay, so basically, apocrine glands are very similar to merocrine glands. Okay, so essentially, when we're talking about a merocrine gland, basically, merocrine glands release their secretions via exocytosis. Okay, so the axonus, the cells in the active area of the cell, okay, have these secretory vesicles, you know how exocytosis works, that fuse with the plasma membrane, and then the secretions will actively be, passed out, and then up through the duct, and then out to the other body surface. Okay, now like as I mentioned, apocrine glands are, this modality of secretion is kind of similar, except instead of secretory vesicles, what happens are the cells actually slough off chunks of their plasma membrane, and then those chunks of the plasma membrane essentially are carrying the secretions out of the gland. And again, people like to argue about, do these actually exist in humans or not? And then holocrine glands, these are essentially where the glands, the cells of the glands, I should say, what they do is they sit there and they produce their secretions, all right, and then the secretions just accumulate and accumulate and accumulate and accumulate and pile up inside of these cells, and then eventually the accumulations of the secretory products are going to get so vast and great inside these cells that the cells are essentially going to burst and break open. Okay, so then basically that's how the secretions are released through holocrine glands, are this, basically through cell death, and then the secretions travel out the duct. Okay, and more than just the oils or the or the products will be released out of these glands. The dead cellular, particles will be released as well. All right, and then, the good example of this in the human body would be sebaceous glands. These oil secreting glands. All right, so basically you're having these oils and other proteins leaked out of the gland and onto hairs in the skin. All right, so that's all these three terms mean, are just again, modes of secretion. I mean, realistically, apocrine. You really need to focus on that. I'd say put more of your focus on merocrine and holocrine. Exocytosis versus cell death by massive accumulation. So, all right. So this is kind of the brief talk I want to give on the glandular epithelial tissue. If you guys have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, and keep studying hard. And as they say on the Red Green Show, keep your stick on the ice.